Last night, Texas Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick went on Tucker Carlson to express his view that we should consider opening back up the economy, even though the coronavirus pandemic is still ongoing. And I have a few things to say about it. So let's take a look, then we're going to talk about it.
Lieutenant Governor Patrick agreed to join us tonight. We're happy that he did. Lieutenant Governor, thanks so much for coming on. So you made clear, and I wanted you to say this and not me, but you made clear in this letter that you sent that you're in the category of people who face real risk from this disease. And I thought that kind of put it into perspective a little. Would you explain that?
Yeah, I turned 70 next week, Tucker. And, I sent you a note about a week ago that something has been really heavy on my heart since this started. And, so I'm automatically in the high risk pool. And I'm, as Lieutenant Governor, I work 12 or 15 hours a day, mostly from home now, but I travel when I need to. I'm living smart, listening to the president, the CDC guidelines, like all people should, but I'm not living in fear of COVID-19. What I'm living in fear of is what's happening to this country. And, Tucker, no one reached out to me and said, as a senior citizen, are you willing to take a chance on your survival in exchange for keeping the America that all America loves for your children and grandchildren? And if that's the exchange, I'm all in. And that doesn't make me noble or brave or anything like that. I just think there are lots of grandparents out there in this country, like me, I have 6 grandchildren, that what we all care about and what we love more than anything are those children. And I want to, live smart and see through this, but I don't want the whole country to be sacrificed. And that's what I see. I've talked to hundreds of people, Tucker, and just in the last week, and making calls all the time. And everyone says pretty much the same thing, that we can't lose our whole country. We're having an economic collapse. I'm also a small businessman. I understand it. And I talk with business people all the time, Tucker. And my heart is lifted tonight by what I heard the president say, because we can do more than, one thing at a time. We can do 2 things. So, my message is that let's get back to work. Let's get back to living. Let's be smart about it. And those of us who are 70 plus, we'll take care of ourselves, but don't sacrifice the country.
So I disagree. I think that if you're trying to make it a trade-off between the health of workers and the health of the economy, I think that that is a false choice. And Crystal Ball jumping in on it to dunk on Dan Patrick here, saying, which stage of capitalism is it where we sacrifice our grandparents for the good of the stock market? And by the way, it's not just Dan Patrick out here talking like this. If you actually go through, there's a lot of people talking like this right now. I was reading this article this morning from the Wall Street Journal. As economic toll mounts, the nation ponders trade-offs. And as you might guess, if you actually go through and read the article, the kind of trade-off which this article is talking about is the Dan Patrick trade-off. The question is, how much of the economy are we willing to sacrifice for the health of the elderly people? And the mission of politics right now is to find that balance, make that trade-off. And Donald Trump out here also talking sort of like this a little bit here, saying, we cannot let the cure be worse than the problem itself. At the end of the 15-day period, we will make a decision as to which way we want to go. Of course, though, Donald Trump out here, all caps with exclamation marks. Don't we love his Twitter style? In this article here, Trump says he wants to ease up on coronavirus-related shutdowns, quote, pretty soon, amid concerns about the economy. So it would seem that the debate which we're having right now, at least among a number of Republicans, and actually I want to be fair, there are some Democrats even who are making this argument, making this case right now that, look, the economy is completely falling apart. We've got to, at some point, balance that trade-off, because they would respond to Crystal. They would respond to Crystal Ball and say, look, Crystal, the economy is not just the stock market. When we talk about the economy, we're talking about a lot of people losing their jobs. In fact, if you actually go look here, the actual, it is the president of the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis was out here saying that the jobless rate, unemployment may reach 30%. I mean, guys, that is completely insane. That is unprecedented. That is Great Depression. No, that is worse than Great Depression, right? That's like 5% worse than it was in the Great Depression. So, I mean, that would be an absolute travesty, an absolute disaster. And when we start talking about people losing their income, when we start talking about people losing their jobs, we're not just talking about the stock market. We're talking about issues with childhood nutrition. We're talking about issues with education as local and county governments struggle to find, funding for schools. We're talking about issues where an entire generation of young people entering the workforce, leaving either college or high school for the first time, entering the workforce, not being able to find good paying jobs, and then spending the rest of their life playing catch up. And you can imagine that leads to all kinds of other problems down the line. And so they say, look, this is right now about balancing those two major and legitimate concerns, they would argue. And I hear that. I hear that argument. And I think in many respects, it's a fair argument to make. I don't know that Dan Patrick did a particularly good job making his case, in that video. But I would respond to that and say, look, it's not a question about sacrificing the elderly for the economy. It's a question of who sacrifices for whom. Because there actually are proposals out there right now, and they're being implemented in a number of other countries right now, that might be able to save the economy while still allowing us to practice social distancing and still keep the elderly safe. One great proposal, which we're seeing in this country right now, are some stuff from Bernie Sanders, for instance. He's talking about $2,000 a month cash payments. He's talking about canceling student debt. He's talking about universal health care to make sure that people who can't afford health care are able to, not be worried, right? Because what you have right now are people who might be sick, but then don't go to the doctor because they're worried about their bills, their medical bills, and that can just lead to, the disease spreading more. And so, in other words, what Bernie Sanders is talking about is quite seriously the largest redistribution of wealth in the history of this country. So again, it's not a question of does the elderly have to give up their lives in order to help the economy. It's a question of who pays for whom, who sacrifices. Because the one thing I do actually agree with when it comes to Dan Patrick is I actually do agree that this is a question of sacrifice. This is a question of someone has to sacrifice, and the question is who makes the sacrifice? Do we tell the person who spent their entire life working for a corporation who, by the way, didn't care about them anyway and would have shipped their jobs overseas if they could have saved 15 cents, who worked their entire life for that company, now finally retires, and then the company turns around and says, hey, look, I need you to actually die for me or take a risk on your life for me in order for me to now make money, in order for me to keep making money because, stock market, because of the economy, because of this coronavirus, etc. That's the question which we're faced with. The question is never, when it comes to the economy, the question of the economy is never less or more. The question is always a question of guts. It's always a question of resolve. The question is, do we have the guts to take on the fossil fuel industry when it comes to climate change? Do we have the guts to take on the large multinational companies who have shipped our jobs overseas, and now all of our medical supplies are being produced in China, and so we're left to basically beg China in order to send us medicine, which, by the way, their whole supply chains got cut down from this coronavirus thing anyway. Who pays the cost of that cost? Who pays the cost? Does the companies who made that choice? Do the people who were involved in making those decisions, cutting those trade deals, do they pay the cost of this? Or do the workers who already paid the cost of having their jobs shipped overseas? Who pays the cost for this, right? That's the question. That's the debate which we should be having. Instead of framing it as the economy is just a thing that exists. That's just what it is, right? Because that's really what it is. It's the economy is a certain form, a certain structure. You can't restructure the economy, they say. Ignoring, by the way, the fact that every single country has literally a different form of capitalism. In Germany, for instance, you have workers on the board, et cetera, et cetera. What I'm saying is there are different ways to think about the economy. There are different ways to think about redistribution. So the idea that the challenge in front of us is letting old people die or helping the economy or letting the economy die is a completely false choice. The question, no, that's not the question. The question is, are we willing to stand up to the companies, stand up to the large multinational corporations and tell them that they have to pay serious taxes? Because the debate right now, which we're also having, is when it comes to, for instance, means testing on some of the cash payments. Because it does seem as though Donald Trump and basically everyone is on board with some kind of cash payment. Now, the Republicans want to do a one-time check. Democrats in general want to do monthly, although not all Democrats are on board with that. So that's a debate which we're having. But also, we're having a debate about the issue of means testing, which, by the way, Bernie Sanders doesn't want to do that. Whereas, Nancy Pelosi, Chuck Schumer, and a lot of Republican leadership and a lot of Republicans are talking about means testing. And there's essentially two reasons, by the way, why you don't want to do means testing when it comes to this is because, first of all, we got to get the checks in the hands of people now. People need cash now. Americans need cash now. And, so if you try to tie it up with a bunch of squabbles about debates about who gets what and et cetera, it takes longer and you're not going to be able to get the checks into people's hands in time. The second reason, though, is one thing which we're seeing with this economic catastrophe is a lot of people who might have been doing really well off a year ago aren't doing well now, or they won't be doing well in a month as more jobs continue to get lost. Right? You could have a situation where a family's making, both parents are working, but the family's making, maybe $110,000 a year, $100,000 a year. Like, they're doing good. They're in the middle class. They're maybe even the upper middle class. But then one parent loses their job and suddenly they're struggling to make housing payments. They're struggling to make car payments, et cetera, that they would have been able to easily make before. So what you got to do is you got to put the money in people's hands. Send every single American a $2,000 a month check, a $2,000 a month prepaid debit card, basically. Allow them to use that money. And then what you do is you tax them back for it next time around and be like, okay, then you look at the numbers and be like, okay, based on what happened, you didn't really need the money, but you definitely did, et cetera, and then you figure it out that way. But of course, though, there's an issue with that because Republicans don't want to, literally part of the issue with why that's not happening is because Republicans don't want to make it into a tax later on. They're worried about the word tax. They don't, that's literally what part of it is. And so they think that means testing it up front is a better way to do it. No. That's not a good way to do it. That's not, anyway. But the thing that I want to talk about here that I've, that I'm trying to say is that at the end of the day, this is not a debate. This is not a question of elderly people dying or letting the economy die. This is a question of who in the economy pays, who in the economy sacrifices for others. And so, anyway, I think that that's what we got to do. We got to tax the rich. That's the solution. Anyway, so if you like the video, I'd really appreciate it if you hit the like button and consider subscribing. Thanks.